Hey Jauza, do you know we're gonna have another public holiday soon?
Oh, you mean the National Day?
Not exactly.
Then what is it?
Well, we're gonna talk about that in today's episode, but for now, welcome to Reassess Behind the Lights.
We break down how people are responding to viral posts and issues. But we don't just tell you about what people are talking about. We also take a closer look on why they react in certain ways.
Are their opinions based by facts, or are we just spreading misinformation? So hit the subscribe button and notification to make sure you don't miss out on a single episode. And with that, today we're discussing the presidential election. The presidential election happens once every 6 years. Just like our general election, the voting day will be a public holiday.
Oh, so that's the public holiday you were talking about? But I bet that there's other people out there who thinks that the next president is not as important as the public holiday.
Well, of course they are. Just take a look at this Reddit thread and its most upvoted comment. And this isn't just the only comment. There are many others who feel the same way as well.
Why do many Singaporeans feel this way?
Of course, Jauza, these are just a handful of Singaporeans. There are others who actually devote and invest their time in their favourite candidate as they prepare for the big voting day. However, there are just as many who actually think that there isn't much for a president to do in such a tiny little dot of a country. Some even think that the role of the president is merely like a figurehead or like a puppet. Others even think that the president should be removed from the Singapore governing system because it is irrelevant.
You know, it seems like there's a lot of misconception about the role of a president. So Kai Xin, could you enlighten the commenters as well as our viewers about what exactly our president does for our country?
Sure. So the roles of a president can be split into 3 C's: constitutional, ceremonial, and community. Constitutional roles refers to the legal matters that the president is involved in. In a way, the president acts like a guardian over our past reserves. And in layman term, past reserves refers to the assets that are owned by the government. And because Singapore, we don't really have much natural resources, it is considered crucial to have these as safety nets whenever there's a nationwide crisis. And because of that, to prevent the misuse of any of these reserves, the government will require the president's approval before they can make use of them and withdraw any funds out of it. And did you guys know, back in 2009, our former president S.R. Nathan gave his approval to the government's proposal to withdraw 4.9 billion from the reserves to fund for the budget. Without his green light approval, this wouldn't have been possible.
Yep, and this brings us to the second C, which represents ceremonial. As the head of state, the president represents Singapore at ceremonies. Domestically, they open each session of the parliament and deliver an address laying out the government's key priorities. They also preside over major state events such as the annual day parade and swearing-in ceremonies of key appointment holders. Internationally, the president promotes ties between Singapore and other countries by making state visits overseas and hosting dignitaries who visit Singapore. It is also important to note that a meeting between countries at head of state level is the highest form of diplomatic changes.
The last C is community. The president actively advocates for social causes. Ever since the year 2000, the President Challenge, also known as PC, has raised over $10 million to help 60 beneficiary organizations for the underprivileged. In the year 2018, our President Halimah Yacob has revamped the PC such that $20 million is raised yearly over the next 5 years to help vulnerable communities integrate into society. Anyways, there seems to be other concerns and issues surrounding our presidential election. Many commenters feel very pessimistic towards our voting system. And why is that?
Well, of course, other than the president being known for merely being a figurehead, many Singaporeans also seem to have, lost all hope in the chance of actually voting for who will be the next president.
Wait, you mean there's a chance we cannot vote for our own president?
Yes, sadly, that is true, and this is due to many strict requirements that potential candidates have to meet in order to be able to run for the presidential elections. And this results in many potential candidates in the past suddenly withdrawing from the elections. And in many cases, only one eligible candidate was left, resulting in something that is known as a walkover, where that one eligible candidate will then become the next president of Singapore for the next 6 years. And according to this Reddit commenter, which was one of the most upvoted comments in the thread, says that basically, throughout the history of presidential election, there's only been 2 times where Singaporeans got to vote. This commentator is statistically correct. Take a look at this set of statistics from the Election Department Singapore website. This only shows how strict the requirement for even running for president are in the first place. And as you saw just now, the longest serving president, S.R. Nathan, had been a walkover president throughout his 2 terms of serving presidency. Let's look at how and why the last presidential elections ended in a walkover back in 2017. Firstly, the elections that year were reserved only for Malay community, and that results in 2 of the 5 hopeful candidates being ineligible in running for elections. And as for the other 3 candidates who actually met their criteria, well,
there were other criteria that the 2 didn't meet?
Yep, that's right. As it was a new condition to run for candidates to have a company with 500 million in shareholder in equity for 3 years before elections. All the other remaining potential, other than Halimah Yacob, just sadly didn't make the cut. This year, however, the presidential elections will be a little different. Maybe there'll be a chance for us to vote more as there's a rise of competition.
This year's election is actually the first open election ever since 2016 where they improved on the eligibility criteria for both public and private sector service requirements.
Yep, an open presidential election means it's open to any potential candidates of any race. The opposite of an open election would be a reserved one, which happened in the last election and is used to reserve an opportunity for minority race group to lead the country. But not just anyone is eligible to run for presidency, of course. There are requirements for both the public and private candidates.
Yes, a candidate from the public sector would be someone with background in politics or has to work in a government company, for example, our Housing Development Board. And it will require them at least 3 years of service as well as the PEC requirement, which takes into consideration of the nature of the office they're working at, their performance, and any other consideration that seems fit to be considered. And this is to ensure that the candidate has the suitable skills, suitable attitudes to carry out the duty of the president effectively.
Yup, and similarly, a private sector candidate must have served as a CEO for a company for at least 3 years. An example would be George Goh Ching Wah, former of the Harvey Norman OSEA and chairman of OSEA International. During their 3 years as CEO, the company must, on average, have at least 500 million in shareholders' equity and have made profit after tax throughout that time. So, Kai Xin, do you know what is the writ of election?
Not actually. Is it something important?
Yes, it is actually. Well, a writ of election is when our Prime Minister would order the holding of an election. And this is the first step to any government election. The reason I brought that up is actually because the private candidate running for presidency would have to resign from their position as CEO before the date of writ of election. And during this period of the candidate's last day of service as CEO till 3 days after or the date of the writ of election, whichever happens first, the company must not have been subjected to bankruptcy.
Otherwise, the private sector service requirement can also be met if the candidate has served at least 3 years in office in a private sector organization and has satisfied the PEC requirements, which consider once again the nature of the candidate's office, the size, the complexity, and their performance, as well as any other factors that seem fit to suit.
And that is actually all for today's episode, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and catch us in the next episode of Behind the Lights, where we'll examine the reactions to another viral issue. Bye!
Bye-bye.